this is my first time in Portugal, so I'm very grateful for the hospitality that has been shown. I hope to come back again soon. I leave tomorrow, so it was a very quick trip, but it's an honor to be here at the University of Coimbra, one of Europe's oldest universities. So thank you all for your attendance today. The title of my talk is Should We Live Forever? Aquinas on Human Immortality and the Problem of Evil. In this talk, I try to explore the problem of evil from the perspective of human immortality and human death. And so, I approach it from a Thomistic perspective, and I put that into some contemporary conversation. So the first portion of this event will be my lecture proper, and then we'll have an opportunity for question and answers. So feel free to write down your questions as we go along, and I hope to be able to answer, or at least respond to all of that. Many arguments against human immortality have been made in recent years. Bernard Williams' own critique, chief among them. Williams' argument goes something like this. Annihilation, he says, is good for us, because eventually our categorical desires must run out. When they run out, immortality becomes not just pointless, but nightmarishly oppressive. For Williams, these categorical desires are what make us who and what we are. They're the highly particular, circumstantial, forward-looking commitments, caring for mom, living with or for a beloved spouse, writing that novel, enjoying that long-awaited, richly deserved retirement that make personal existence worth living. But these forward-looking commitments just can't go on forever, Williams says. Eventually their goal is achieved, or your personal interest in them is exhausted. If immortal, and also sufficiently healthy and youthful, as immortalists tend to hold, we must either fall into endless, intolerable boredom, or must acquire new categorical desires, whereby we cease to be who and what it is we are. Immortality, then, being the annihilation of the self by another name. Since the human self, for Williams, is a finite constellation of specific categorical desires and memories that ultimately derive their meaning and identity from temporal limitation, it follows that a meaningful life, on Williams' idea, can only come from death. Death, he says, is the whole point of life. Martha Nussbaum is not alone in thinking Williams' argument imaginatively narrow. In fact, she thinks it's not an argument so much as the expression of a particular temperament, she says. It's fine and good, she says, that Williams and others don't find endless life personally fulfilling or attractive. But please don't let them speak for everybody. Mainly, though, Nussbaum doesn't think Williams adequately addresses the livability of endless life, by which she means its potential for never-exhaustive richness or variety. Because there are countless colorful combinations of human experience, surely, she says, surely the mixing and mingling of these jumbles with this addition or that subtraction can make for endless arrangements and thus continual possible sources of human fascination. Above all, there's always those never-exhausting, unpredictable human relationships that give a reason to existence. Even so, Nussbaum doesn't think immortality is, after all, something worth seeking. She gives a yet better reason for thinking so, a reason she lifts from Lucretius for why personal immortality is something we shouldn't desire. She thinks we ought to embrace a personal annihilation, not because it's a good in itself, but because it's a necessary condition for the perpetuation of ways of life that we greatly value. It makes room, in other words, for future potential life, which we should desire. In other words, endless personal life, my endless personal life, because it would be a drain on the world's finite resources in some time, should make other new life unachievable or potentially impossible. For posterity's sake, then, we shouldn't hope to hang around endlessly. True, she concedes, new habitable planets could provide us with heaps of more resources, and technology could become so advanced that this existence might somehow be stretched, but she still thinks such circumstances would only delay the inevitable problem. Eventually, likely as not, we would still hit against that same wall of finitude, and should then find ourselves needing to impose pragmatic laws that would not only be ethically questionable, but psychologically or personally unendurable. Long ago, as an undergraduate in some grade school program, I faced a similar question when reading John Milton's poem, Paradise Lost. Generally, my peers and I used that great poem as a pretext for critiquing or even condemning our favorite hated religious ideas. Perhaps the sole reason the poem is even taught in American universities today. In that poem, we confronted a particular kind of immortal human existence that, even with its sunny garden and in its enchanted trees, seemed totally insufferable. Heaven would just be awful, my peers said. Who could stand it? But I remember thinking, evidently channeling the spirit of Martha Nussbaum, well, it depends how immortal life works and what the humans are like who have it. Everybody, I thought, was assuming it necessarily meant this kind of life, with all of its kind of limitations, and with these temporal kinds of goals or ends, everything the same except stretched. Yet our anthropology, or our philosophical definition of human nature, entailed something exclusively temporal and secular, unending human life among human beings, exactly as we today know it or experience it to be. Far from considering or remotely understanding specific theological doctrines, like the fall of man, supernatural grace, or the beatific vision, we simply took immortality to mean this kind of life, only stretched to its breaking point. We were being, you could say, in the words of Martha Nussbaum, imaginatively narrow. In any case, I think that that kind of life would be, if you'll pardon the expression, hell. To stretch out that kind of life, or to delay death till some unimaginably further point for the sake of more time, or more life as we know it, seems like a goal only a very particularly awful villain would ever dream up. Imaginative fiction, from Frankenstein to the Lord of the Rings, gives us plenty of reasons for thinking so. But so do all the news channels. Death, God or not, seems a blessing. It at least puts a cap on all the outrage. In this talk, I intend to address the question of immortality from a Thomistic point of view, to see what it can tell us about the problem of evil. The two topics actually go remarkably well together, because they both follow a similar thread of thinking. The goal will be to say something about the problem of evil that is not emphasized enough. But we will allow the problem of death, if you'll permit me to call it that, to be the frame for this discussion. Even when you break up thinkers into two general groups, annihilationists and immortalists, while good-naturedly admitting the possibility of some in-between categories, you could still very easily situate Thomas Aquinas among the immortalists. Aquinas thinks that makes a human being is not annihilated at death. The human soul, by which he means not some ghostly holographic entity, but a metaphysically fundamental principle of intelligibility, persists and is not corrupted. The human soul, which he calls a substantial form, is a that by which the human being is a human being. The other that by which is matter, though personal identity belongs to the soul, not to matter. Since the human soul or form is the root of intellect and will, and since this root with intellect and will persists, Aquinas can say that something personal persists, even if it is not quite right to say that this human soul is precisely the same human person, that is, the same me, as the fully bodied human being. But we're going to sidestep the personhood question for the sake of staying on target, just as we're not going to draw out how hylomorphism works or at all the metaphysics that this argument stands on. Other Thomists treat such matters extensively. Suffice it to say that for Aquinas, the intellect and will that persists as a soul separated from the body is the same intellect and will that was present in the fully bodied pre-mortem or pre-death human being. It's our business here to keep in mind that it is not theological doctrine or religious testimony that convinces Aquinas that the human soul survives death. For him, it is a conclusion anyone wanting to be philosophically and logically consistent must arrive at. Aquinas generally presents two proofs for the immortality or incorruptibility of the human soul, but both have to do with conceptual thought, or the human ability to cognize concepts. Essentially, Aquinas thinks you can't get thought from some purely material thing. And I apologize. Usually I have a little clicker, and I will try to remember to provide you here, I think we're right here. I'll change the slides accordingly, I promise. Essentially, Aquinas thinks you can't get thought from some purely material thing. Here is his first proof. From Summa Theologiae 1, question 75, article 2. Merely material things are always specific and individual. In other words, anything stored in matter, whether a picture on paper or a file in a hard drive, is always a this or that. A drawing of a triangle has a specific color, a specific size, or specific angles. It can't be triangularity in general. It can be only that thing, the triangle. But our minds can grasp general things, concepts, not just specific things. What Aquinas means is that your intellect can understand the universal essence of a triangle, which he calls its definition, which applies to every triangle that has ever existed or ever will exist. You aren't thinking of just that thing, the triangle. You are grasping a concept that is non-singular or non-particular, which covers all of them at once. Therefore, he argues, the part of you that thinks can't be purely material. If the mind were strictly a physical organ, it would be limited to storing specific singular things. Since the mind can hold universal, non-singular things or concepts, it isn't reducible to matter. Now, the critic usually argues that material systems like computers or brains handle universals through categorization or symbolic processing. However, Aquinas would argue that these systems are not actually grasping a universal. They're merely manipulating particulars that signify a universal to an external observer. If the intellect were a material organ, it would be restricted by the conditions of matter, which are always thisness, contracted to a specific time, place, and individual quantity. A physical neuron or a silicon chip is always a particular singular entity. If the mind were purely material, every concept it held would necessarily be individuated by that matter. You would not possess the concept of triangle. You would possess a specific physical triangle representation in this neuron. For the mind to truly reach a universal, that is to grasp a definition that applies to an infinite number of particulars simultaneously, it must be able to grasp the object without its material conditions. If the act of understanding were a material change, like a chemical reaction, it would result in another particular. But the act of understanding is an intentional state where the essence of the object exists in the mind without its material limitations. Therefore, the power that performs this stripping or abstraction can't itself be material. If the intellect were material, it would be opaque to the universal. It would just be one more particular thing bumping into other particular things. Here is Aquinas' second proof from Summa Theologiae Prima Pars, question 75, article 6, and also in Summa Contra Gentiles 2, chapter 55. A natural desire, he argues, is an inclination flowing from a being's essential form toward a goal or object that must be possible to obtain, lest the nature itself be internally incoherent. The intellectual soul, though, in itself possesses a natural desire for perpetual existence, esse perpetuum, because it apprehends being as universal and timeless, which is to say non-singular and non-particular. Therefore, the natural annihilation of the intellectual soul is impossible. Now, in this talk, we don't have time to unpack each of these arguments piece by piece. My point is that for Aquinas, these proofs are not merely abstractive or probabilistic arguments, as if to make best sense of the facts as we have them. He understands them as proper demonstrations, but the main reason I bring these proofs up at all is because I wish to point out that the second proof depends on some of the ideas of the first, which helps us see a very important feature of Aquinas' argument about the natural desire for immortal existence. Because of the relationship of the two proofs, we are prevented from describing Aquinas' second proof as mere wishful thinking. To do so is to miss entirely the proof in its form. The first proof establishes for Aquinas that the soul is an immaterial subsistent form. The second proof establishes what this immaterial subsistent form does. It naturally desires esse perpetuum, or perpetual being, as a good in itself. The first proof allows Aquinas to show that our desire in the second proof is intellectual, not instinctual, or as if reducible to some mere biological inclination for survival. Therefore, this natural desire for esse must be a natural desire in a very technical sense of the term. One could object that the entire case for immortality hangs precariously on the claim that conceptual thought requires an immaterial power. This is correct. However, this dependency is not a vulnerability. If one rejects the immateriality of the intellect, one must also accept the consequence that no human thought is ever truly about anything in a determinate sense. If the mind were a purely physical organ, or using a purely physical system, every thought process, from simple addition to complex metaphysical reasoning, would be inherently ambiguous and compatible with an infinite number of conflicting interpretations. A material brain can only produce physical patterns that are assigned meaning by an external observer. It can't possess a meaning in itself. Therefore, the objection that the argument depends on immateriality is actually an admission of the stakes. Either the intellect is immaterial, incapable of reaching the absolute or the objective, or the intellect is material, and we are reduced to biological calculators for whom truth is merely a useful but semantically hollow fiction. We can and must then distinguish at this point between mere velleities and natural desires. A velleity is at most a psychological event, a wish for something you think might be nice or pleasant. But a natural desire is not a mere wish, like wishing to be rich or to have magic powers. A natural desire instead is a built-in trajectory of a thing's nature. It is, we might say, an ontological hunger. To reduce these natural desires to velleities, in fact, results in a gross absurdity. You don't have a world that is merely cruel, but incoherent. Nor can one just dismiss the idea that there are natural desires. For to say there's no such thing as a natural desire would be to reject the idea of having a nature at all. That comes with a pretty substantial cost. Some are willing maybe to bite that bullet, but as we'll see in a moment, to reject the idea that there are such things as natures entails something else altogether undesirable. But let's have another example to show what we mean by natural desire. Human beings have the natural desire to know the cause of any effect they witness. If this natural desire were mere wishful thinking, the human mind would be a tool for a task that doesn't exist, like having a key in a world without locks. Try to imagine this for a moment. You would be asking why, where an answer was not merely impossible, but the question itself only meaningless. A mind that hungers for why, but where there was no reason why, is a mind that is not merely frustrated, but absurd. The mind would not just be uselessly or pointlessly asking a question. It wouldn't be able to ask a question at all. The mind or intellect would be a functional absurdity, a power essentially defined by a pursuit that was not possible. This would more than just collapse the intelligibility of our universe. To deny the objective goal of this natural desire is to argue that a being with this sort of nature is itself fundamentally directed towards something that was nothing. You might say, but Father, please, any person can desire some absurd thing. A child might desire to be an elephant, but everyone knows that desiring or wishing doesn't make it so. But that would be to miss entirely what Aquinas' point, or the point he's making. Let's use that example. In that scenario, the elephant-minded child, by its very nature, by the very kind of being she was, would be requiring existence as an elephant, not merely wishing for it or craving it with all her child heart, but essentially and metaphysically oriented toward it, even while not being it. It would mean that the somehow human child by nature was and wasn't an elephant. In other words, that essence that made her the kind of being she was would manifest in an existence that was another kind of being altogether. She would be A and not A. She would have both a nature that did not have an existence and would also somehow have an existence that did not have a nature. Two incomplete things that together were and weren't one thing. But Aquinas thinks such a being is a metaphysical monster. But this monster could not hope to exist. Such metaphysical monsters, he thinks, are impossible. A being whose essential nature was a built-in contradiction. But by contradiction, he's not saying that there would be, in this case, some kind of misalignment. He's saying that some being A can't be not A at the same time and in the same respect. A being, by virtue of its being a being, is necessarily a something. If a specific being were essentially oriented toward unrealizability or impossibility, it would be a being that was not a something, and thus not a being. And Aquinas thinks this is not just absurd, but impossible. Keep in mind that Aquinas is not just making an argument against the existence of, say, dragons. Aquinas is making a subtler point. He's saying that a dragon can't both be a dragon and not a dragon in the same respect. If it's a dragon, it then has dragonish realizability as a dragon, and thus capacities, powers, and desires that are natural to its dragonishness. But it can't both be a dragon and not have this dragonish realizability, these dragonish capacities. That's not just a chimera, but nonsense. It would have no coherent unitive nature or existence, and therefore could not be. That's his point. So return to our argument. Because the human soul is an immaterial intellectual substance that apprehends being universally, it possesses an essential ontological hunger for perpetual being. Aquinas is saying that to call this hunger a mere velleity would be to assert that the human person by nature is a metaphysical monster in the ways I just described. But this Aquinas thinks violates reason itself, for it would affirm a nature that is fundamentally structured by its essence toward an end that is impossible, thereby rendering the person a monster, an impossibility. But we can also interpret the first proof by the lights of the second. We see that the intellect's ability to grasp being as such is a natural desire for perpetual being. In the first proof, Aquinas shows that the mind is immaterial because it sees beyond the thisness of a thing and reaches its essence, its nature. This essence, which is the philosophical definition of a thing, is non-singular. We realize that when the soul apprehends esse, or existence in being, in this universal way, it doesn't just see an abstract concept. It recognizes esse as something that transcends the here and now. Perpetual being is not just a wish for a long life or for an infinite string of Saturdays, which would be mere horizontal extension. Perpetual being for Aquinas must mean participation in a state of being that has moved beyond becoming and into isness, or actuality. For Aquinas, perpetual being isn't just stagnant, repetitive, horizontal extension of life, but actualized ongoing existence, a life defined by perfection and fulfillment. If immortality meant only the ongoing existence of this current life, it would be an endless series of not-yets. This would indeed be nightmarish, like somebody forced to eat a dessert that would never stop being served. But perpetual being is the mind reaching for a state of actuality, a state that is no longer seeking, but which has attained its goal, what it was made for, a state that is no longer subject to the coming to be or passing away of our world, but which has found ontological wholeness, permanence, or perfection. And if we mean life in that sense, when we ask the question whether we should live forever, then the answer that Aquinas must give is an emphatic yes. So we might well ask at this point, but how does this address the problem of evil? Let's unpack that problem, and we'll begin to see. The problem of evil is usually put like this. If God is all good and all powerful, then why is there so much evil or suffering in this world? A good God would wish to prevent suffering. An all-powerful God would be able to prevent it. Yet we see suffering everywhere, often on a horrendous scale. The conclusion that many professional philosophers draw, at any rate, is that the existence of evil is incredibly strong evidence against the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God. Even if evil or suffering doesn't prove atheism outright, the problem of evil makes theism seem pretty unlikely. The resolution, now, to what we might call the problem of death lies in the fact that our natural desire for perpetual being is not a mere psychological wish to escape the grave, a mere velleity, but an ontological hunger for actual, perfect existence. In the mind of Aquinas, this hunger is the signature of a nature that belongs to the order of actuality. Similarly, then, for the problem of evil, our desire for an answer, or for evil to be made sense of, or as philosophers often say, defeated, is or cannot be a mere velleity for the same reasons. When we demand that evil be made sense of, or suffering be made sense of, we are not merely wishing for a consoling story to be told. We are asserting the metaphysical claim that reality is, at its root, intelligible. In the Thomistic tradition, a natural desire points to something that must be the case because of something that is. If evil were truly unanswerable, our very capacity to be troubled by it would be impossible. Our moral outrage is, in fact, the sign or witness to the solution. It fastens us to a perspective from which evil is not unanswerable, but in being problematic at all, presumes a metaphysics that must also provide an answer. For the problem of evil to succeed, both as a refutation of God and as a genuine ontological dilemma, it would have to point to a deprivation in our world over which God has no power to fulfill, an absolute whole in being that is beyond the reach of the source of being itself. But Aquinas is right to reject this as a metaphysical impossibility. For evil to be a genuine refutation of or argument against theism, it has to meet precisely two conditions. Evil has to be something over which God is rightfully sovereign, and evil must be described as genuinely disordered in a world ordered by perfect goodness. Those are the two strict conditions. Depart from either one, then the dilemma at the heart of the problem of evil turns off. From these two conditions, one must then identify a clear example of evil that is under God's power and goodness, and yet somehow irredeemably resistant to it. That would be the test case that upsets or overturns theism. I am going to show now that the problem of evil is only resolvable, and thus only morally significant, on the Thomistic framework of evil. Outside of that framework, the problem of evil is not a problem for theism, and never even gets off the ground. It's not in that situation that evil is unanswerable, or unassailable, or its meaning is unknowable. It's just that outside of Aquinas' metaphysics of good and evil, it fails to be a problem or dilemma at all. But as I will show, these conditions only take intelligible shape on Aquinas' view. Only if evil is a lack of due good can it be both under God's sovereignty and yet appear as something that ought not to be. Thus, something like Aquinas' account uniquely makes the problem of evil a real challenge, but also uniquely renders it resolvable. On Aquinas' view, evil isn't a thing. He doesn't mean that evil isn't real. He means there's no such thing as positive evil, or evil as something existing on its own. A tree exists. That's a positive thing. But evil, for Aquinas, is a broad term for describing various kinds of lack in real or positive things. When a tree has all its branches cut off, It is experiencing a kind of evil, a lack where there was once no lack, or what we might call fullness. As a result of this particular lack in its being, the tree dies. We see there are many kinds of evil because there are many kinds of things. And everything that exists is a kind of thing with an essence or a nature. Some philosophers reject the view, as I said earlier, that things have natures. But I find they often do so because they're not quite sure what Aquinas and others mean by it. For Aquinas, the idea that things have natures or essences is just the view that beings have intrinsic characteristics with defining capacities, what are often called in today's literature powers, that are rooted in that which makes them what they are. A tree has the power to take in nutrients and grow. A bird has the power to fly. A human being has this or that power, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, many philosophers who reject this essentialism do so on account of a commitment to nominalism, the view that all talk of natures is nothing more than convenient labeling. Most contemporary metaphysicians today aren't really nominalists in the old medieval sense of the term, however. Many of them are quite comfortable talking about and acknowledging essences, natural kinds, and so on. But the problem of evil, Aquinas would point out, is only a problem at all if, then, some version of essentialism is true. That is, if real beings with real natures have fullness and lack. But if nominalism, that is the medieval version of it, is true, then there is no problem of evil at all. Because then things would have no real natures that could be fulfilled or deprived, and nothing could then count as genuine lack, and evil would be nothing more than aesthetic or subjective disapproval. It would mean saying not that something was wrong, but only that I didn't particularly like it. And the only important thing to note is that this very idea of evil presupposes, though, essentialism, since without real natures, there could be no standard of deprivation, only neutral events totally without any kind of meaning at all. So if you're a nominalist in the medieval sense, you can't actually rely on the problem of evil as an argument against God. For if you're a nominalist, there isn't a problem of evil to begin with. I only mention this point about nominalism, not because I think that in order to resolve the problem of evil, we must be able to explain how or why nominalism is false, but to show that if nominalism were true, there couldn't be a problem of evil at all. Certain conditions have to be met in order for the problem of evil to be a problem. You can't throw away these various conditions and still have the problem. A subset to one of the two conditions I mentioned earlier then, and from a Thomistic perspective, has to do with Aquinas' privationist account of evil. For Aquinas, evil is not a positive thing, but a privation, the absence of some good proper to a being by virtue of its nature, as blindness is an absence in a creature whose nature gives it the power for sight. Calls this the evil as privation view, or the privationist account. The tension in the problem of evil is resolved by what we'll call Aquinas' victory thesis, or the idea that God permits evil only insofar as it is subordinated to the good. The privation view says that evil has no positive being. It is always a lack of some due good. But if that is true, then by definition, evil can't stand outside the order of goodness. It exists only as parasitic on what is good, and therefore can't be ultimate, irredeemable, or totally resistant to that order. That's precisely what Aquinas' victory thesis means. Evil is always subordinated to the good within divine providence. Philosophers have sought generally two ways of avoiding this metaphysics: by describing evil as a principle alongside the good, or what is loosely called dualism, or the idea that evil is somehow a positive reality, or what we might call the positivist theory of evil. But on dualism, evil is a principle alongside the good, a brute fact over which God has no sovereignty. The question, why would God permit evil, then can never arise. But on the positive theory, evil is a real property or disposition in creatures, say Kant's corruption in the will, and thus simply one more item in the furniture of reality, like weight or color or appetite. But then the positive theorist faces a dilemma. If evil is a positive property in creatures, then either it must exist independently of God or be created by God. If The first, then we're back in dualism, since evil becomes a metaphysical principle outside of God's sovereignty, which violates one of the two conditions I spelled out earlier. And dualism can't have a problem of evil. But if the latter, then evil is something God directly brings into creation, authors it as such, which also undermines the very structure of the classical problem of evil. For in that case, evil is not puzzling or parasitic, but just one more created reality, like mass or color, so that there's no "why would God permit it" problem left. The cost, then, is that the very structure of the classical problem of evil evaporates on this positive take. The problem of evil is only a problem at all because it depends on evil being something that ought not to exist in a creation ordered by and under the protection of perfect goodness, an absence or privation of do good that, to whatever extent, jars against divine perfection. If evil is instead a positive thing God makes, then it ceases to be something that ought not to exist and simply becomes one more thing God chose to include in his world of objects. In that case, evil is like heat or rocks. It's not a puzzling absence, but just another thing. If it is undesirable, it's not undesirable in a moral sense at all, but in a purely aesthetic sense, like a skunk's stench, something distasteful to us perhaps, but not something that carries the weight of moral contradiction. The paradox vanishes because the problem of evil only arises if evil is something God himself can't directly will, if evil is a privation of do good. The paradox consists in the fact that evil, something God himself can't will for its own sake, and primarily because it's a privation of some perfection, occurs. In other words, the positive theory of evil makes evil metaphysically unproblematic, whereas only the privation theory makes evil metaphysically parasitic, and thus actually philosophically paradoxical. The moral to draw here is that the problem of evil, in order to be a problem at all, only makes sense on Aquinas' privation view of evil. It has only any bite or venom on the privation theory, where evil is the absence of a do-good in beings that are ordered by divine wisdom. What follows, then, is that in order for evil to be unanswerable, these following things would have to be true. Going back here. Evil would have to be something that rivaled God and somehow did not fall under his power. Or two, it would have to be something that fell under his power but was somehow irresolvable. But even granted such things could be the case, and Aquinas rejects that they can, on either view there is still no problem of evil. The problem is dissolved, because the tension in evil is dissolved. It no longer means anything. Moreover, our desire for an answer would be some kind of velleity, some kind of psychological response. It would not pose a philosophical question or objection. Similarly, in order for the soul to be annihilable, what would have to be true is that the intellectual power in the mind could not grasp concepts or universals, and our hunger for things like truth or existence or goodness were vain. But even granting such a thing was the case, and Aquinas rejects that it can be, then there would still be no problem of death. The problem would be dissolved, because the tension in death, in this case, is dissolved. It would no longer mean anything. Our desire for more life would only be a kind of velleity, and would not pose a philosophical question or objection. Just as Aquinas argues that we have an ontological hunger for perpetual existence, he says we have an ontological hunger for goodness, and not a horizontal goodness, a mere tallying up of pleasures that can outweigh all pains, but a vertical or actualizing goodness. To seek an answer to evil is to seek the restoration of a privation by the only thing that can fill it, the presence of actuality itself. If our desire for the why were a mere velleity, then the silence of the universe in the face of suffering would be a disappointment, and not one standing on moral legs, and importantly, not some kind of ontological contradiction. Only if this desire for the why is in fact a natural desire could evil even appear to be an ontological contradiction. If our yearning for an answer to evil, or for the perpetuation of our being, were a mere velleity, just some wish for a more comfortable arrangement of facts, then death and suffering would be problems only in the sense that a rainy day is a problem for a picnic, a clash of preferences. However, for these to be metaphysical problems, they must represent a rupture in the order of being itself. By framing these yearnings as natural desires, Thomas Aquinas asserts that they are the gravitational pull of an essence toward its proper or natural end. For the intellect to recognize evil as a problem is for it to perceive an objective privation of a good that ought to be present. If the desire for a resolution were not a built-in trajectory of our nature, the problem would simply vanish. Therefore, the very reality of these problems serves as a witness. By characterizing our desire for an answer to evil, not as a wish, but as a signature of a nature that belongs to the order of good in actuality, we realize that the problem is actually a paradox. We find evil intolerable because our intellect is already calibrated to a standard of goodness, just as we find death unnatural because our form is ordered toward perpetual being. To reduce these desires to velleities would be to render the human person a metaphysical monster, a creature equipped with a compass for a world that doesn't exist. Instead, for Aquinas, the profound ache of the problem of evil is the intellect's own testimony, that it was made for a solution or resolution, a state where the whole of privation is merely ignored but is entirely actualized. I conclude this talk arguing that we should, by virtue of our human nature, live forever, and thus can't help desiring to do so, just as we can't help desiring to find an answer to the problem of evil. If we did not desire these things, it would not just follow that there weren't answers, but would follow that there could not be questions. Just as the nature of the soul is not made for some annihilation, so the nature of being is not made for unanswerable evil. Only if evil were unanswerable would the problem of evil demonstrate an ontological dilemma, and only if annihilation were the destiny of the soul would death be natural to it. But if evil were unanswerable, there would not be a problem of evil. And so too, if annihilation were the end or destiny of the human soul, there would be no problem of death. Now, some people may be prepared to admit that. Like Bernard Williams, they could be inclined to think that perpetual life, even as Aquinas describes it, would still become nightmarish or onerous eventually. This objection, however, misses the mark in either one of two ways from a Thomistic point of view. Either it rests on a category error regarding the nature of the intellect and thus treats immortality as a quantitative extension of time, a horizontal sequence of finite experiences, rather than a qualitative transition to absolute actuality. Or it claims that the perfection of the intellect is inimical to the intellect. Neither position makes much sense from the Thomistic point of view. On the one hand, for Aquinas, immortality doesn't mean the horizontal kind of life as we know it. On the other hand, to reject this ultimate desire for perpetual being is akin to making the claim that one doesn't desire to know the causes of things, which doesn't make much sense in this scenario, since the entire philosophical or scientific project presupposes this natural desire. To claim that the intellect would find its own perfection burdensome is to suggest that a thing's fulfillment is its destruction. Just as a traveler in a desert does not find the eventual discovery of a spring onerous once he begins to drink, the intellect cannot be bored by the very truth it was designed to encompass. Thus, the objection, if it takes the latter option, is not a refutation of immortality, but a denial of the intelligibility of the human person. One can't consistently affirm the existence of a rational intellectual nature while simultaneously claiming that the ultimate satisfaction of that nature's power would be a catastrophe. Consequently, the answer to whether we should live forever is found in the requirements of our human nature. Just as evil is only a problem because it's a privation of a do-good, death is only a problem because it's a privation of the life proper to an intellectual nature. To deny immortality is to deny the coherence of human nature and the intelligibility of the human person, reducing our capacity for universal truth to a functional absurdity. My aim here has been to show that the resolution of the problem of evil and the problem of death meet at the same point. The necessary transition from a state of privation and becoming to a state of absolute actuality, wherein the actual natural hunger of our nature is satisfied only by the realization or fulfillment of its own potentiality. Thank you.